There's a particular silence that falls over a kitchen table when someone has just told you your entire future no longer belongs to you. I sat in that silence for almost a full minute before I found my voice again, and I remember, distinctly, the sound of the refrigerator humming behind me, ordinary and indifferent, while everything I'd planned for 18 years quietly came apart. My name is Tamsin Okoro, and I was 18 years old the summer my mother told me, over a pot roast neither of us finished eating, that she'd given my entire college fund to my younger sister. I'd worked for that fund since I was 14. Not entirely alone, I'll be fair about that. My grandmother, Beatrice, had started it when I was born, faithfully depositing small amounts every month for years before she passed when I was 12. My mother, Ivy, had continued those contributions afterward, though inconsistently, and I'd added to it myself through 4 years of after-school jobs, babysitting, a part-time position at a pharmacy that let me stack extra hours during summers. By the time I turned 18, that fund held just over $31,000, enough to cover most of my first 2 years at the state university I'd already been accepted into. The acceptance letter still magnet to our refrigerator that very evening. "Your sister needed it more," my mother said, not quite meeting my eyes, twisting her napkin in her lap in a way I recognized as guilt trying to disguise itself as practicality. "Deja's baby is due in October, Tamsin. She needs a deposit for a bigger apartment, medical bills, things a baby actually requires right now. Your school can wait a semester. Maybe 2. You'll figure it out. You'll figure it out." For words that would replay in my head for years afterward, words that somehow managed to erase 18 years of careful planning in the same breath they used to explain why that erasure was, apparently, reasonable. My sister, Deja, was 23, 7 months pregnant, and had never once, in all the years that fund had been growing, contributed a single dollar to it. She sat across the table that evening, eyes fixed firmly on her plate, saying nothing, which somehow felt worse than if she'd tried to defend the decision at all. I looked at my mother's face, searching for some flicker of doubt, some sign that she understood the magnitude of what she'd just told me. I found none. Only the calm, settled certainty of a decision already made, already spent, already impossible to undo. I pushed my chair back from that table and stood up, though I had no idea yet exactly how far that single motion would eventually carry me. "I need you to understand the shape of my family before this moment makes complete sense, because context matters, even when context doesn't excuse what happened. My father had left when I was 9, a slow, unremarkable disappearance rather than a dramatic one, phone calls growing less frequent until they simply stopped altogether. My mother raised Deja and me largely alone after that, working double shifts as a hospital administrative assistant, and I'd spent most of my childhood watching her stretch every dollar as far as it could possibly go, understanding intuitively, the way children in tight households often do, that money in our family was scarce and precious and never, ever to be wasted. Deja had always occupied a different position in that household than I did, 5 years older, treated from early on with a kind of protective indulgence my mother rarely extended toward me. I'd told myself for years this was simply birth order, simply the ordinary dynamics of any family with more than one child, but looking back now, I recognize a pattern I was too young and too eager for my mother's approval to fully see at the time. Deja struggled in school. I excelled. Deja moved through a series of jobs she rarely kept longer than a few months. I held the same part-time pharmacy position for 3 consecutive years, saving methodically, meticulously, understanding college as the single clearest path out of the financial precarity that had defined my entire childhood. My mother used to tell people, at family gatherings, how proud she was of my grades, my work ethic, my determination to build something better for myself. I believed, foolishly, that pride translated into something more substantial than words offered at holiday dinners. Deja's pregnancy had been unplanned. The father, a man named Curtis, already largely absent from the picture by the time she reached her 2nd trimester. I understood my mother's worry for her, genuinely did, understood the fear of watching your daughter face motherhood without adequate support or stability. What I didn't understand, sitting in that kitchen watching my acceptance letter hang uselessly on our refrigerator, was how that worry translated so seamlessly into a decision that required no consultation with me whatsoever. No conversation about alternatives, no acknowledgement that the money in question represented not just numbers in an account, but years of my own labor and sacrifice. I stood at that table, my chair scraping against linoleum that needed replacing years earlier, understanding for the first time in my life exactly how far my mother's love for me actually extended when weighed directly against my sister's needs. It didn't extend nearly as far as I'd always assumed it did. Are you enjoying the story? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. If you're enjoying it so far, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Because believe me, this story is only getting started. Now let's get back into it. Sit back down, Tamsin, my mother said, her voice carrying the particular tone she used when she expected immediate compliance, a tone that had worked on me reliably for 18 years. It didn't work that evening. You spent my college fund, I said, my voice shaking slightly despite my effort to keep it steady, without asking me. Without even telling me beforehand. I found out over dinner, the same night I was supposed to be celebrating my acceptance letter. I don't need your permission to make decisions in this house, my mother said, defensiveness rising quickly to replace her earlier guilt. I'm still your mother. That money was always mine to manage, however I saw fit. Grandma Beatrice started that fund for me specifically, I said, feeling something hot and unfamiliar building in my chest, something that felt less like ordinary teenage frustration and more like genuine grief. I put my own money into it for 4 years. That wasn't just yours to give away. Deja finally looked up from her plate, her expression carrying a complicated mixture of guilt and defensiveness that told me she understood, at least partially, how significant this moment actually was. Tamsin, I didn't ask her to do this. I didn't even know until she told me last week. But you took it anyway, I said, turning toward her, watching her flinch slightly at the directness of the accusation. You didn't call me. You didn't ask if there was another way. You just let her hand it over. What was I supposed to do? Deja said, her voice rising defensively. Refuse help for my baby because it might inconvenience your college plans? Inconvenience, I repeated, the word landing like a slap. You think 4 years of after-school jobs, for years of babysitting and pharmacy shifts, for years of planning my entire future around that money, amounts to an inconvenience? My mother's hand came down flat against the table, sharp and sudden. Enough. Both of you. This conversation is over. The money is already spent, Tamsin. Deja's apartment deposit went through this morning. There's nothing left to argue about. Already spent. This morning. Before dinner, before this conversation, before I'd even been told anything had happened at all. I stood there in that kitchen, understanding with sudden, devastating clarity that this decision hadn't actually been a decision at all, not in any sense that included me as a participant. It had been a fait accompli, executed and finalized before I'd ever been given the chance to react, to negotiate, to even simply be informed. You'll figure it out, my mother said again, quieter this time, though no less final. You're smart, Tamsin. You'll find a way. I looked at her for a long moment, searching for some remaining trace of the mother I thought I'd known. Then I walked out of that kitchen, out of that house, into a summer evening that suddenly felt entirely unfamiliar. I spent that first night at my best friend Priya Chandrasekhar's house, sitting on her bedroom floor until nearly 3 in the morning, replaying every detail of that dinner while she listened, alternating between outrage on my behalf and careful, practical questions about what I actually planned to do next. You can't just walk away from your family over money, Priya said at one point, though her tone suggested she understood, even as she said it, that this situation involved far more than simple money. It's not about the money, I told her, though I recognized, even as I said it, that this wasn't entirely true either. It's about being told I'll figure it out. It's about 18 years of working towards something and having it disappear in a single conversation I wasn't even part of. I didn't go home the next day, or the day after that. I stayed with Priya's family for nearly 2 weeks, her mother, a kind, no-nonsense woman named Fatima, never once questioning my extended presence, simply setting an extra plate at dinner each night without comment. During those 2 weeks, my mother called several times, her voicemail shifting gradually from irritated instructions to return home to something closer to genuine worry, though never, I noticed carefully, anything resembling an actual apology for what had happened. Tamsin, this is ridiculous. Come home. We need to talk about your plans. Tamsin, please call me back. I'm worried about you. Tamsin, I don't understand why you're punishing me like this. Punishing her. As though my absence, my grief, my genuine need for space to process what had happened constituted some deliberate act of cruelty on my part, rather than a natural response to having my future dismantled without consultation. I finally called her back after 2 weeks, not to reconcile, but to inform her I'd decided to defer my university acceptance for a year and move into a small shared apartment with 2 coworkers from the pharmacy, a plan I'd spent those 2 weeks quietly, methodically constructing with Priya's help. That's throwing away everything you worked for, my mother said, her voice tight with disapproval. You're being dramatic, Tamsin. You could still figure something out for this fall if you just came home and we talked properly. I am figuring it out, I said, echoing her own words back to her deliberately. Just not the way you expected. The silence on the other end of that call stretched long enough that I wondered if she'd hung up. You're really not coming home, she finally said, and I heard, for the first time, something that sounded almost like genuine fear beneath her earlier defensiveness. No, I said quietly. I don't think I am. I had no idea, ending that call, exactly how much that single decision would eventually reshape not just my own life, but the entire structure of my family's future. The following year unfolded as the hardest, most transformative period of my entire life, working full-time at the pharmacy while sharing a cramped 2-bedroom apartment with my coworkers, Denise and Kayla, both of whom became genuine friends through months of shared exhaustion and careful budgeting. I applied for every scholarship and grant I could possibly find, spending evenings after work drafting essays, gathering recommendation letters slowly, methodically rebuilding a financial foundation for college that no longer depended on anyone's permission or goodwill but my own. My pharmacy manager, a sharp, observant woman named Rosalind Achebe, noticed my determination during that year and became an unexpected mentor, encouraging me to pursue a pharmacy technician certification program that would both increase my income and provide relevant experience for the pre-pharmacy track I decided to pursue instead of my original, more general business degree plans. You've got the discipline for this field, Rosalind told me one evening, reviewing a scholarship essay I'd asked her to look over. I've watched you handle inventory systems most new hires take months to understand. Don't let one bad year convince you that you can't build exactly the life you were planning before. I earned my technician certification within 8 months, securing a raise that made the shared apartment's expenses considerably more manageable, and by the following spring, I'd assembled enough scholarship funding, combined with careful savings, to finally enroll at the university I'd originally been accepted into, 1 year later than planned, but entirely on my own terms. I heard from my mother occasionally during that year, brief, strained phone calls that never quite addressed the underlying rupture between us, conversations that circled carefully around the actual wound instead of directly confronting it. Deja's baby, a daughter named Harmony, was born that October, and I sent a small gift through the mail, unable yet to bring myself toward an in-person visit, though something in me softened slightly imagining my niece's small, unknowing existence, entirely separate from the complicated adult conflicts surrounding her arrival. My mother mentioned, during one particularly strained call, that Deja was struggling more than expected, the apartment deposit and initial expenses having consumed most of the fund quickly, remaining bills piling up faster than anticipated. I just wish things had gone differently, my mother said, something almost like regret threading through her voice for the first time since that original dinner. I wish you'd asked me first, I said honestly. That's really all I ever wanted. Not necessarily a different outcome. Just to have been included in the decision at all. She didn't respond directly to that observation, the silence between us stretching uncomfortably before the conversation shifted toward safer, more superficial topics. I had no idea, Hanging up that call, exactly how much longer this careful, painful distance between us would ultimately need to stretch before something resembling genuine reconciliation became possible. I started university that fall, 1 year later than originally planned, carrying a combination of scholarships, savings, and the same fierce, self-reliant determination that had carried me through the previous difficult year. I declared a major in public health, drawn increasingly toward healthcare policy work after watching, firsthand through my pharmacy job, how financial precarity shaped people's access to basic medical care, an interest that felt, in retrospect, directly connected to everything my own family's financial instability had taught me. I met Professor Alma Vasquez during my second semester, a public health researcher whose course on healthcare equity reshaped my entire understanding of the systemic patterns underlying individual family struggles like my own. She noticed my engagement with the material, my particular focus on financial barriers to education and healthcare, and eventually invited me to join a small research team studying exactly those patterns within underserved communities. "Your personal investment in this material is obvious," she told me during office hours one afternoon, after I'd shared, cautiously, some of my own family history in relation to a class discussion. That kind of lived understanding, combined with rigorous research skills, could actually shape meaningful policy work someday, if you're interested in pursuing it seriously. I was interested. More interested, honestly, than I'd expected to be, finding in that research work a sense of purpose that extended my personal grievances into something considerably larger and more meaningful. I saw my mother twice during that first year, both times brief, careful visits during holidays, conversations that remained polite but distant, neither of us quite ready to fully address the wound that still sat, mostly unspoken, between us. Deja reached out directly for the first time during my second semester, a text message that arrived unexpectedly one evening. "Can we talk?" "Just us, no mom." I've been thinking about a lot of things. We met at a small coffee shop near campus, Harmony, now over a year old, balanced on Deja's hip throughout most of our conversation, and I watched my sister, for the first time in longer than I could remember, speak with something resembling genuine vulnerability instead of defensiveness. "I've felt guilty about this for a long time," Deja admitted, watching Harmony reach for a napkin on the table between us. "I told myself, at the time, that I didn't have a choice, that mom made the decision, and I just accepted help I desperately needed. But the truth is, I could have said something. I could have asked her to find another way, or told her I'd figure out something myself instead of taking money that wasn't really hers to give." I sat with that admission for a long moment, feeling old anger soften slightly, though not entirely, into something more complicated. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Because watching you build your life back from nothing this past year," Deja said, "made me finally understand exactly what I let happen to you." "I'm sorry, Tamsin. I should have said this a long time ago." That conversation with Deja marked a genuine turning point, though I want to be honest that it didn't immediately repair everything that had fractured between our entire family that summer evening over pot roast neither of us finished eating. We began texting regularly after that coffee shop conversation, small, ordinary exchanges that slowly rebuilt something between us that felt more honest than our relationship had been even before the college fund incident. I visited Deja and Harmony more frequently, watching my niece grow through her second year with a tenderness that surprised me, given how tangled her arrival had once felt with my own significant loss. My relationship with my mother remained more complicated, our conversations still carrying an undercurrent of unresolved tension neither of us quite knew how to address directly. It was during my junior year, nearly 3 years after that original dinner, that circumstances finally forced a more direct reckoning between us. My mother called one evening, her voice carrying an unusual vulnerability I hadn't heard from her in years. "I need to tell you something, Tamsin. I've been diagnosed with early-stage breast cancer. The prognosis is good, they caught it early, but I'm going to need treatment over the next several months, and I wanted you to hear it directly from me." I sat with that news for a long moment, old anger and immediate, instinctive worry colliding uncomfortably in my chest. I'm coming home this weekend, I told her, the decision arriving without conscious deliberation, some deeper loyalty overriding years of careful distance. I spent that weekend at my mother's kitchen table, the same table where everything had originally fallen apart, having the conversation we'd both been avoiding for 3 years. I need you to understand something, my mother said, her voice unsteady in a way I'd rarely witnessed from her. I've regretted that decision every single day since I made it. Not because Deja didn't need help, she genuinely did. But because I never once considered how it would affect you, never asked, never even really imagined your perspective mattered as much as her immediate crisis did in that moment. I told myself you were resilient, that you'd figure it out, and I used that as permission to avoid the harder conversation of finding another solution that didn't require taking something that was rightfully yours. Why didn't you say any of this sooner? I asked, feeling old grief resurface alongside cautious, uncertain hope. Pride, mostly, she admitted. And fear that admitting how wrong I'd been might mean losing you completely, rather than just the distance we've maintained these past 3 years. I watched you build an entire life without needing me at all, Tamsin, and some part of me became afraid that acknowledging my mistake wouldn't actually bring you back, that it might just confirm how unnecessary I'd become to your life. I reached across that table, the same table where everything had once fallen apart, and took my mother's hand, feeling something complicated but genuinely healing settle between us for the first time in 3 years. My mother's treatment unfolded over the following 6 months, and I found myself, somewhat to my own surprise, taking a more active role in her care than I'd expected given everything that had happened between us. I coordinated my class schedule carefully around chemotherapy appointments when I could, drove home on weekends when travel allowed, and discovered, through the practical work of caregiving, that old wounds could coexist alongside genuine love and concern. That forgiveness didn't require forgetting what had happened, only deciding, deliberately, how much space that old grief would continue to occupy. Deja and I coordinated care schedules together during this period, our own relationship strengthening considerably through shared responsibility for our mother's well-being, harmony often accompanying us during hospital visits, her small, cheerful presence providing welcome relief during otherwise difficult days. I keep thinking about how differently things might have gone, my mother said during one particularly difficult chemotherapy session, her voice weak but clear, if I'd just asked you both to sit down together. If I'd treated you like an actual participant in a decision that affected your entire future instead of someone I could simply inform after the fact. We can't change what happened, I said, sitting beside her hospital bed in a chair that reminded me, uncomfortably, of a similar chair I'd occupied years earlier during a different family member's illness. But I think we're finally learning how to actually talk to each other now, which maybe wouldn't have happened without everything that fell apart first. That's a generous way to look at it, she said, managing a tired smile. I've had 3 years to practice being generous about it, I said honestly. It took a while to get here. My mother's treatment proved successful, her prognosis improving steadily through the following months, and by the time I entered my senior year, she'd been declared cancer-free, a milestone we celebrated together with a dinner that felt, deliberately, nothing like that original meal 3 years earlier, held instead at a small restaurant none of us had complicated history with. I want to do something, my mother said during that celebration dinner, to try to make right what happened with your college fund, even though I know money can't fully repair what actually broke between us that night. She'd been quietly saving, she explained, small amounts each month since her diagnosis had forced her to reconsider what actually mattered in her life, determined to eventually repay, at minimum, the portion of that original fund I'd personally contributed through years of after-school work. You don't have to do that, I told her, though something in her determination to make the gesture, regardless of its practical necessity, moved me considerably. I know I don't have to, she said. I want to. Some debts aren't really about the money, Tamsin. They're about finally taking responsibility for what you took without asking. I graduated the following spring with honors, my public health degree complete, already accepted into a graduate program focused on healthcare policy. The same field Professor Vasquez had helped me discover years earlier through research work directly connected to my own family's financial struggles. My mother sat in the audience that day alongside Deja and a now 4-year-old Harmony, all three of them present in a way that would have seemed impossible during those difficult early years of estrangement following that original, devastating dinner. She handed me an envelope after the ceremony, tears already gathering in her eyes before I'd even opened it. "It's not the full amount," she said, watching me carefully as I opened it to find a check for $8,000, "but it's what I've managed to save since my diagnosis. I know it doesn't undo what happened. I just needed you to know I've been serious about making this right, in whatever small way I actually can." I sat with that check for a long moment, feeling old grief and genuine, hard-won healing tangled together in a way that felt entirely appropriate given everything our family had navigated across the previous 4 years. "Thank you," I said finally, meaning it completely. "This means more than the money itself, Mom. It means you finally understand why the money mattered in the first place." Deja hugged me tightly after that exchange, Harmony wrapped between us, small and giggling, entirely unaware of the complicated history her own arrival had once been tangled within. "I'm proud of you," Deja said quietly. "I don't think I've ever actually said that directly. I'm proud of everything you built, even though I know part of what made you build it was losing something I benefited from taking." "We're okay," I told her, and found, saying it, that I genuinely meant it. "We got here eventually. That matters more than how difficult the path getting here actually was." I started graduate school that fall, continuing the research work Professor Vasquez had introduced me to, my thesis eventually focusing specifically on financial barriers facing first-generation college students, work directly informed by everything my own family had navigated together. I think, often, about that original dinner, about the pot roast neither of us finished eating, about my mother's 4 devastating words that once felt like the absolute end of everything I'd planned for myself. I understand now, with the clarity only years of difficult, deliberate rebuilding can provide, that walking away from that table hadn't actually been about abandoning my family. It had been about finally, completely, insisting on being treated as someone whose future actually mattered enough to include in the conversation. It's been 6 years now since that dinner where my mother told me she'd given my college fund to my sister and instructed me to figure it out. 6 years since I pushed back my chair and walked out into an evening that felt, at the time, like the absolute unraveling of everything I'd carefully planned for my entire life. I work now as a healthcare policy analyst, focusing specifically on programs designed to support first-generation and financially vulnerable college students, work that grew directly from the painful, formative experience of watching my own educational future dismantled in a single conversation I wasn't included in. My relationship with my mother has become something genuinely healthy now, built carefully across years of honest conversation, sustained accountability, and the shared crucible of her illness, which somehow, despite everything, brought clarity to both of us about what actually mattered in our relationship moving forward. Deja and I remain close, Harmony now 6 years old and utterly unaware of the complicated history surrounding her early arrival into our family, simply delighted, these days, by her aunt's regular visits and the elaborate stories I tell her before bedtime whenever I'm staying over. I think, often, about Priya's mother, Fatima, setting an extra plate each night without ever once questioning my extended presence in her home during those difficult early weeks. About Rosalind Achebe, believing in my potential during a year when I barely believed in it myself. About Professor Vasquez, who helped me transform personal grievance into meaningful, purposeful work. I think, most of all, about that 18-year-old girl standing up from a kitchen table, uncertain exactly where she was walking toward, only certain she couldn't remain sitting in a silence that had just erased her entire future without so much as a conversation. People ask me sometimes whether I regret that year of delay, that difficult, exhausting stretch of working full-time while rebuilding my educational path from nothing, comparing it unfavorably to the smoother, more conventional path I might have followed had that college fund remained intact. I tell them the truth. I don't regret it, not anymore, Though I understand why that answer might surprise people who've never had to build something entirely from their own resourcefulness after having their expected foundation abruptly, painfully removed. That year taught me something no conventional college experience could have provided, something about resilience, about the particular clarity that arrives when you're finally forced to advocate completely for yourself, about the difference between love that considers your needs as genuinely important and love that simply assumes your resilience will absorb whatever convenient sacrifice someone else's crisis requires. My mother gave my college fund to my sister without asking and told me to figure it out. I did figure it out, eventually, though not in the way either of us initially expected. I figured out exactly who I was capable of becoming once I finally stopped waiting for permission to matter as much as everyone else's needs always seemed to. The end.